Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah. Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah. Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah.
Now myself, Imam Majid, inshallah, will proceed to take questions. Dr. Altaf Hussain, I asked Dr. Altaf to join. Dr. Altaf, of course, mashallah, is very skilled in this field. So I'll let him answer the questions. Those of you that don't know, he's a Mufti, as well as the military. We got in trouble when we talked about that last time. But so we'll answer the questions, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll try to see, try to combine them, as well as there's some quick questions. I'll rather leave the questions for Imam Majid. The first question was just about the organization. What is ICNA Relief and how is it different from Helping Hand and Islamic Relief? ICNA Relief is the only Muslim organization that's been founded as a relief agency specifically dedicated to domestic relief. So ICNA Relief does not operate outside of the United States. All of ICNA Relief's projects, so there are about, if I'm not mistaken, 13 women's shelters around the country, Feed the Hungry programs, disaster relief, aiding people that are in need within this country, Muslims and non-Muslims, for bounty programs that are run locally. So the vision of ICNA Relief is what I talked about in the lecture, which is specifically to free the hearts of the people, inshallah, to really be ambassadors of our faith and action, inshallah. So that's what ICNA Relief is. Helping Hand is an international relief organization, so it deals in many other countries, and of course, obviously, Islamic Relief as well as a separate entity that deals with local projects as well as international projects. Which questions are mine? Apologies. All right. What is your advice to youth whose heart is a young person whose heart is closed? Any message coming from their parents, the media, and society, peer pressure plays a role in shutting the heart. It's a little difficult to address the question. Of course, you can chime in, inshallah. But as far as a young person who's saying that it's difficult to accept advice from their parents, actually today, we read in Surah Al-Ahqaf. By the way, the story of Altaf Hussain, because a few people asked me, the ayah is actually in Surah Al-Ahqaf, right before these ayahs that talk about parenting, which we talked about today. On the second page of Surah Al-Ahqaf, the story of Qaydina, Wabnu Qaydina, Alimina, Wabnu Alimina. That story is also one that's narrated in authentic hadith, Muslim Imam Ahmad. But in essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِي قَالَ لِوَالِدَيْهِ أُفٍّ لَكُمَا أَتَعِدَانِي أَنْ أُخْرَجَ وَقَدْ خَلَقِ الْقُرُونُ مِنْ قَبْلِي وَهُمَا يَسْتَغِيثَانِ اللَّهَ وَيْلَكَ آمِنْ إِنَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقٌّ فَيَقُولُ مَا هَذَا إِلَّا أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after describing the young person who grew up, who recognized the sacrifice of his parents or her parents, and was making the same du'as and was a righteous person growing up as an adult, for their own children, for their parents, and for the blessing of Islam, and to do good deeds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there's a person who responds to his parents, as their parents consistently give them advice and say, وَيْلَكَ آمِنْ, woe to you believe. The promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true. And he responds, مَا هَذَا إِلَّا أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. These are just old stories of the past. These are just fables of the past. Now, I don't want to get into too many conspiracies and things of that sort, but how can a person read the Quran and really be affected by it if they watch movies all day and all night, and they watch media where things that aren't real are portrayed as real in high definition, and you're reading about ayats of hellfire, but then you look on, you're watching movies like Saul and stuff like that, and people being murdered in brutal ways and things of that sort. Your world becomes warped. Okay, whenever you allow yourself to indulge too much into the media. I'm not saying, look, there's what's ideal and there's what's realistic. I'm not saying that you have to cut off TV and movies and things of that sort completely. But at the same time, your world becomes warped whenever you indulge too much into those types of things. And SubhanAllah, one of the the reasons that we see that the Dajjal would come at the end of time, and that we would see that people would be easily fooled, is because people no longer know what's distinguish, how to distinguish truth from falsehood. What is real and what is an illusion. They really don't know anymore. So they're minor objects of Dajjal, of deception and delusion. And obviously, Dajjal being a master of delusion and the master of deception is able to take advantage of people like that. So a person should really, first and foremost, dedicate much of their time to enriching their minds and enriching their hearts. A lot of times youth tell me, for example, that I'm having doubts about my faith. And subhanAllah, I think as Muslims sometimes we underestimate the value of reading books that were written to non-Muslims about the proofs of Islam. This is something that our ulama spoke about in the past. As a Muslim, if you read a book from Shaykh Ahmed Didat, rahimahullah ta'ala, for example, about the proofs of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, comparing the Quran and the Bible, when you see these debates and things of that sort, which talk about the proofs of Islam, these are things that strengthen you in your faith. These are things that make your heart more content with Islam. I can tell you for a fact, and honestly, and without going too far into details of my own personal life, I went through a phase of discovery as well. I studied other religions. Every single time I studied Islam, it made so much sense, and so my heart became more content. Because I genuinely wanted to know what the truth was. My heart became content with it as well. So studying the faith for yourself, I think one of the problems with Muslim youth sometimes is that they take Islam only from their parents. Right? So Islam is only what my parents told me it is. Right? So if my parents told me some really backwards cultural, whatever, misconception of Islam, I took it as Islam. Therefore, I can, with no reasoning and no understanding of why this and why that, and then I go out and I'm exposed to this world of ideas, which include a lot of deception, illusions, and things of that sort. Of course, you're going to have doubts about your faith, and of course, you're going to find your heart closed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you haven't studied it for what it really is. I remember, when I was in New Orleans, and subhanAllah, I was really sad because yes, I was imam there for 6 years, and I also grew up in that community, and a lot of times I had to counsel friends of mine. Okay, people that were my age, friends of mine, I had to counsel them because of their doubts in their faith. And I remember that there was a person in particular who was, just an all-around, mashallah kid. Straight A's, whole life, med school, everything like that. Got into med school, just killed the MCAT. Everything was going well. And this is actually a friend of mine, and he tells me one day, I don't think I'm really Muslim anymore. Like, what are you talking about? So what did we say? And I was like, well, tell me what your concerns are. And he said, my dad said this, and I don't think so. I'm like, see, here's the problem. You're an intelligent person. You spent all that time getting straight A's in school and reading about medicine and things of that sort. When's the last time you picked up a book about Islam? When's the last time you actually read about Islam? When's the last time you studied the faith? Okay? And subhanAllah, so he said, but I read, he read a book that was against the Prophet ﷺ. I said, let's go through your concerns. He said that, I read this and this and this and that. And the author said that it was in Raqi' al-Makhtoum. That's not the name of the book. The name of the book is Raqi' al-Makhtoum. Right? The sealed nectar. And he said in Raqi' al-Makhtoum. And I'm sitting there, I'm looking at him like, you mean Raqi' al-Makhtoum? I said, yeah. Alright, fine. We were sitting in the library of the masjid, picked it up. He said, he said this and this and this and that. He had a direct passage. I opened it up, read the context. He said, oh, that makes sense. It's like, see, why didn't you, this is the most basic book of Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Why haven't you ever picked it up? So sometimes that's exactly the problem, that the only source of Islam is your parents. And we love our parents, we respect our parents, and we take advice from our parents, but you need to go a little bit further with your religion than just what Mama and Baba said. Okay? And learn about your religion. And expose yourself to the intellectual proofs of your religion. Allah says many times in the Quran, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Don't they think, don't they contemplate? Our deen is a deen in which we use our intellect to arrive at the conclusion of faith. Okay? So use your intellect to arrive at that conclusion, inshallah ta'ala, and expose yourself more to it. You want to take a question?
I would love to get more involved with non-Muslims, but how do you deal with the awkward situations of becoming too friendly, I guess, with the opposite sex or the opposite gender? They want to greet you, hugs, kisses, catch you off guard. How do you make them understand? Alright. It's funny because me and Dr. Altaf were actually having a conversation over lunch about how we get out of awkward situations.
You know what my thing is? Whenever any, and you guys can try, whenever any, like I see any woman coming at me, like ready to hug me or embrace me, I'm like, can you give me a peace sign? She gives me a peace sign. I'm like, this is pretty cool, isn't it? I was like, all right, now let me explain to you why I can't touch you. You know? So, you know, you laugh it off, and look, let's face it, one of the reasons why, and I'm going to try to word this the right way, inshallah, but one of the reasons why, when we go to interfaith dialogues, when we participate in interfaith service, it's so awkward is because, traditionally speaking, conservative Muslims or Orthodox Muslims never expose themselves to those fields. So the Muslims that have been representing us in those fields for the last however many years have been people that are very loosely associated with Islam. So, you know, the person that's Muslim has been there and serving here and that kind of stuff, and she has no problem hugging guys, he has no problem hugging girls, they have no problem holding hands and singing kumbaya, right? So, what's your problem? And look, you know, let's face it, you know, Muslims who were observant have traditionally shied away from these fields because they want to avoid those awkward situations. Well, look, if you ignore it for another 10 years, it'll only get more awkward in 10 years. So eventually we have to wet our feet and get in this field, inshallah ta'ala, and show what an observant Muslim does. You know, how an observant Muslim can still be friendly, courteous, okay? We can still be courteous with each other. You know, there is a precedent for that in the Sunnah. Okay, we can be courteous with each other, inshallah ta'ala, even with members of the opposite gender without being flirtatious. Because it's teaching people how to observe those bounds. And alhamdulillah, honestly, that's something that I really struggled with when I got involved in the sphere of interfaith, because, you know, when I first got involved in interfaith, I was a lot more conservative, I think, than I even am now. Not that I hope I haven't become watered down per se, but you know, I was probably a little bit more overzealous, and I was really like concerned, like, man, what am I going to do? I was really nervous. Like, I remember I would go to interfaith dialogue, and before I would get out of the car, why are the lights going on? My mic gonna get cut now?
You may have to fundraise for the electric bill.
Speaking of never involving a fundraiser. I remember I would, literally, before I would get in to the interfaith dialogue, I would take my hand and I would rub it on the tire, so that no one would try to touch me. So I'd walk in there with like all this black stuff all over my hands and stuff like that. It's like no one was even going to dare. Or I'd have a tissue and I'd act like I was sick, right? And I was, you know, blowing my nose and stuff like that. And it worked. It worked. But eventually, you know, I think people just got the point, like, all right, you know, just, because that's like an excuse that you use in high school when you're going late to class and, you know, you say that your car broke down. You got, you know, stuff. Actually, I shouldn't be giving you guys instructions. But, you know, there are ways, honestly, we have to wet our feet, inshallah, we have to get in those fields so that we make it less awkward for the generations to come that also want to be observed in the night.
No need to add to what Sheikh Omar was saying, we were discussing this earlier, is that, you know, most people who are not Muslim, when I explain to them about this aspect of it, they're actually very grateful. They actually say things like, you know, no one ever told us. No one ever actually talked about this. And so they'll actually go out of their way. So when I'm working in my field in social work, it's a lot of women. And so it's obvious that you're going to shake hands or you're going to interact with them. But I've come up with a way that I actually, you know, as I'm walking up and I know, I just put my hand to the heart. And I just say, hand to the heart. And they go, what is that? I go, hand to the heart. And they just start smiling. I go, it's another multicultural moment. And they just smile. They go, what are you talking about? And I go, I just... yeah, exactly right. And I was like, I explained to them. And they're so sincere, subhanAllah. One of them said, and when you do that, what am I supposed to do? Because that's how you greet me, so what am I supposed to do? I said, you can do whatever you want to do, but we can't hug. we can't. One of them said, oh, is it Ramadan? Because some Muslims have given the impression that we don't do certain things in Ramadan, but outside of that, it's all, you know. The other one said, no shaking. I said, oh, then can I hug you? I said, no, not that either, right? So I think, as Sheikh Omar said, the idea is that if we take ourselves too seriously, but then forget to explain, the next generation will have it very difficult. Very difficult. But every time you explain, you're taking the trust that Allah has given you with this message, and you're doing your best to convey it. And if you're not clear about it, then at least say that to them. Say, this is something I've been told, I'm not clear about it, but I can try to explain to you more, I'll learn about it more, and they'll respect it. And I'm telling him today, some of my colleagues who are men in the field, at professional conferences, they'll actually watch. And if I'm somewhere and a woman is coming towards me to greet me, they'll go from wherever and intercept the handshake. And the woman will be like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, he doesn't shake hands. She's like, what are you doing? like you're stealing my handshake. And so, but they get it. They're trying to help out. So inshallah, we can try to cooperate in that.
Can you talk about the ayah, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, and how that relates to Rasulullah's love and respect for all of humanity? Furthermore, he had a deep love of all of creation. And as the ayah says, he had love for all creation. His love was with deep affection. Can you stress more the points that we question? Do not do good deeds for da'wah. Okay. We love to do them to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. While da'wah comes as a natural process, many of us who are recovering Muslim activists with much work, like khutbahs and charity, etc., yet we were, by the way, the lights being off kind of makes this harder. Spiritually bereft,
I'm a professor, so I've been trained to read this kind of handwriting. So basically, it says, can you stress more the point that we question and do not do good deeds for da'wah? We do them to please Allah, while da'wah does as well. Many of us who are recovering Muslim activists did much work, etc., yet we were spiritually bereft. We worship da'wah and activism, and contrast this to true da'is who focus on their adab, akhlaq, and closeness to Allah. They were awliya who inspired people, not like many present da'i. I don't read a question, but just maybe to re-emphasize that. Just do it for the sake of
sure. Yeah, so that's the question, or not the question, just to re-emphasize again that it's not a publicity stunt. Look, again, da'wah is a natural aspect of this. So we find statements, for example, from Umar radiallahu anhu, be callers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even as you're silent. They said, how? He said, with your good character. Alright, so those are there. But at the same time, again, we treat humanity well. We love humanity, we love all of creation. Because of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to do, because this is who we are. That was the motive of the Prophet for 40 years before Islam, and continued to be his motive afterwards, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He cared about people, he loved all of creation, and this is something that's deeply, that's very much so alluded to many times in our faith. And what I would say, as far as the last part, which is some da'is are awliya, call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their character and with their love, and unlike some other da'is. Honestly, look, no one knows who the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam called them akhbiya. They are hidden people. What distinguishes our faith from others is that we don't have a spiritual hierarchy. We don't believe in them. We believe that the awliya are akhbiya. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu said Allah has hidden two within two. He's hidden his awliya, his close beloved friends amongst his servants, and he's hidden his pleasure within his good deeds. So you don't know who amongst the people is a wali of Allah, you don't know which of the good deeds is the one which earns the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not just an imam or a da'i that becomes a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu a'lam. And I hope this isn't the case, but the person sitting in front of you might be a complete hypocrite. And you might be a wali of Allah. Right? So don't, and I think that kind of contributes sometimes to that, well, we don't have to do anything because alhamdulillah we have other people that do this and do that. No. You should strive to be that close friend to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that people don't know about. A person who's close to Allah. All the ahadith, by the way, which I find interesting, all of the ahadith that mention the secret awliya of Allah mention it some way in the context of serving the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, the man who the Prophet ﷺ saw strolling in Jannah. The Prophet ﷺ didn't see him strolling in Jannah because he prayed Qiyam al-Layl. The Prophet ﷺ saw him strolling in Jannah because he removed something harmful from the road. Likewise, I mentioned the one hadith in the khutbah today about the woman تقوم الليل وتصوم النهار وتفعل وتصدق, the woman who prays Qiyam al-Layl and fasts and gives charity, but تؤذي جيرانها, but she harms her neighbors. The second part of that hadith is actually the Prophet ﷺ is asked about a woman who prays her maktuba. She prays what's followed upon her. She fasts what's followed upon her. She gives her zakat. And they said the only sadaqah she gives is a few grains extra than her zakat. So just a few grains. But she's good to her neighbors. And the Prophet ﷺ said, he in Jannah, she is in paradise. The very famous hadith about the man who walks into the room, and the Prophet ﷺ says the person that's about to enter amongst you is a man of Jannah. And subhanAllah, this is very significant because Abdullah ibn Umar said this person was such an average person. He said, I followed him home and I asked him if I could stay with him. I stayed with him for 3 days. He didn't fast Monday or Thursday. He didn't pray extra prayers. He didn't do anything extra. He was the average Muslim. Okay? But at the same time, he said, I got frustrated. I asked him, what is it about you? And he said, the only thing is that before I go to sleep, I forgive people. I let go of any grudges. So subhanAllah, the way he dealt with people, he lets go of any grudges, he makes dua for the forgiveness of people. That made him a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amongst a group of Sahaba that were well known, whose names are preserved in history. So many. How about the woman who took, or the man who took his shoe and filled it with water and gave it to a dog, a thirsty dog. All of the ahadith that mention wilayah, that mention a secret close friend of Allah, are mentioned in the context of serving the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are very deeply tied to each other. So if your wilayah, this is something I was at RAS last week in Toronto, and the lecture that I gave actually was about an article that was written by a Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Alan Nuri, who wrote an article called The Allure of Spiritual Narcissism. One of the most powerful articles I've ever read. It was an article written in the Huffington Post, The Allure of Spiritual Narcissism. He said that spiritual narcissism is when the end goal of your spirituality is self-love and feeling amazing. And a lot of times when we talk about spirituality in Islam, it's so that I can feel great, I can feel amazing, so I can deal with my problems. Is the goal of our deen to make yourself happy? Or is it to make everybody else around you happy while not losing your own connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's spiritual narcissism. SubhanAllah, I found that very significant. When you study the life of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and I'm doing the class right now on the tahajjud of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Stranger in the Night. It's a 4-hour class. It's online, some of you might have seen it, on the tahajjud of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the qiyam of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And one hadith, wallahi, that deeply touched me. And it's something that you just read over sometimes, and it's lost in translation. That's certain that Aisha radiallahu anha was asked about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's qiyam, and she was asked, did he ever used to sit down in qiyam al-layl? And she said, na'am, hina haqallahu nas. She said, yes, but only when the people burned him out. When the people exhausted him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning when he got older. And the translation is just when he got old. It's lost in translation. When the people crushed him, when the people physically exhausted him, emotionally exhausted him, so that in the end years, in his last year, he was forced to sit in prayer in Qiyam al-Layl. Now the Prophet loved to do Qiyam al-Layl more than anything else. And subhanAllah, even when he was doing Qiyam al-Layl, Aisha says, one time I woke up and I longed for the Prophet and she said I started to feel where he was, so I grabbed his heel and he was in sujood. And she said the entire night, I heard him saying what he was saying, and he was reciting the entire night into Surah Al-Ma'idah. If you forgive them, or if you punish them, they are your servants. And if you forgive them, then you are the Aziz and Hakim. You are the all-powerful and the most wise. SubhanAllah, Rasulullah was making dua for his ummah the entire night. So he was serving the ummah by day, and at night he was making dua for them. That's not spiritual narcissism. Yes, the Prophet stood up that night and would read the 7 al-Tiwal, the 7 long surahs of the Quran in one rak'ah, which the Prophet would make dua for us. And during the day, the Prophet for the people. So serving the creation embodies spirituality. This is who the Prophet was. This is an essential aspect of becoming a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, secretly serving the creation. And it extends beyond human beings. I know I'm taking really long, but subhanAllah, one of my favorite stories is actually Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah. Not Sufyan al-Thawri. How many of you have heard the name of Sufyan al-Thawri? Not many of you. Sufyan al-Thawri was sahib al-madhab. I mean, he had his own madhab. He was on the same level of scholarship as Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, Imam Layth, Imam Al-Awza'i, and others. He had his own madhab, and he was called Amir al-Mu'mineen al-Hadith, the prince of the believers in Hadith. This is possibly the greatest scholar of Hadith that ever lived, even greater than Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, just as far as his caliber is concerned. Possibly the greatest scholar of Hadith that ever lived. And he was known for being very rigid in regards to his knowledge. He wouldn't lecture more than 3 people at a time. He liked to accompany just a few people, mentor them, which is why his madhab didn't spread too much. But Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah, one time saw a boy who had a bird in a cage. And, he didn't go up to him and start yelling at him and say, don't imprison the bird and those types of things. But he saw the boy, he saw the bird, and he felt sorry for the bird. So he didn't tell the boy that we should free the bird. Instead, he asked the boy if he could purchase the bird from him. So the boy said, okay, fine. So he bought the bird from the boy for 1 dinar, which was a big deal. It's not like the dinar in the Arab countries today, but the dinar was huge. Right? 1 dinar to this boy. The boy was excited. He took the bird and he freed the bird. SubhanAllah, he hit 2 birds in 1 stone. I know it sounds funny considering that we're talking about a bird here. But, in essence, he wanted to make the boy happy. He didn't want to disappoint the boy. And at the same time, he wanted to free the bird. When he freed the bird, in all of his classes of hadith, the same bird would come and just sit down. And subhanAllah, even when Imam Sufyan al-Thawri rahimahullah passed away, the bird attended his janazah. And whenever, about 3 months later, the bird used to always roam around his grave, the bird died right next to his grave, and next to the grave of Sufyan al-Thawri is the grave of that bird. So now, subhanAllah. I mean, that type of rahmah, that type of mercy that Allah puts in the heart of a person, that's part of what makes Sufyan al-Thawri rahimahullah special. That's part of the success that was given to him, was that relationship he had with Allah, where he appreciated the mercy of Allah upon him, he showed that mercy to the creation. Do you want to talk? Why don't you ask me questions? This is really a question for you. While working with other organizations, is there some criteria we should be careful about with regards to Islamic principles? Look, working with anyone in a way that won't compromise our theology. I think that sometimes, I don't know if this is in the I would think this is in the context of service. In the context of service, as long as we're able to practice our faith freely and the restrictions are observed, we're able to do what we want to do, sort of what we talked about just a little bit earlier, then it's fine. And actually, subhanAllah, even if it's time for Salah, take your break for Salah. I remember I had a group of 8 people volunteer on a project on gutting a house in New Orleans. And they missed Salah al-Asr. It was past Maghrib, and then they're coming to the masjid after Maghrib and praying Asr. I'm like, why did you guys miss Asr? So we were gutting the house. I was like, I didn't send you to gut the house so that you could not pray your Asr prayer. Right? You should have taken a break and prayed your Asr prayer. So I find that sometimes, I guess it's a complex, it's an inferiority complex. Sometimes we deal with other organizations, we automatically feel like we should be ashamed of being Muslims. Right? And we shouldn't. Right? We have to remember that we can't sacrifice that. That's one of the reasons why we're here, is because we are Muslims. So we have to make sure that we carry ourselves in a way that we still observe all of the principles of our faith without compromising. In regards to interfaith dialogue, look, people enjoy honest, respectful dialogue. I really can't stand when a Muslim attends an interfaith dialogue and the only thing he keeps saying is like, yeah, we agree with everything you just said. Right? No, we have disagreements in our theology. We have very specific disagreements. And we have very, very, very convincing intellectual proof for our positions as a religion, as Muslims. And answer them in a respectful way, in a loving and respectful way, inshallah, ta'ala, in the spirit of cooperation and understanding, inshallah. And just don't shy away from your faith whenever you cooperate with others. Are you going to answer the question? Is this the last one I'm going to answer before you answer the question? You mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ was quiet even when he was disrespected verbally. What do you advise for someone who is disrespected, insulted continuously? Should they say something back, for example, for people in long-term relationships like family, in-laws, work, etc.? Look, this is a very, very sensitive question. You should not accept dhulm for yourself, transgression for yourself on a continuous basis, especially because that can lead to dhulm towards other people.
So for example, let's say that you're being oppressed by someone in the family. Well, by you accepting that, and subhanAllah, sometimes I get phone calls, and like the phone call will be like this: my husband is beating me, how can I have sabr? I'm like, that's not supposed to be the question. The question is, how can you stop, how can you get out of that situation, not how can I have sabr? Right? So a lot of times, that's the problem, is that, you know, we mistake these ayat and these ahadith to mean that, you know, you should just accept the for yourself. And that's why Imam Qudama rahimahullah said, humility should not lead to disgrace. Humility should not lead to disgrace. When you accept someone to continuously commit ghulm towards you, commit transgression towards you, then you're making it easier for that person to commit ghulm to someone else as well. Okay? So, the context of claiming your rights, when the Prophet accepted that disrespect and things like that. So when the Prophet is walking by and someone says something rude to him, or someone insults the Prophet, you know, this is something that the Prophet is showing his spirit, he's showing his forbearance, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And in the long term, that was actually a good thing. Okay? So you have to think of it that way. What is the end of this? Right? So if in the long term, by tolerating that disrespect and that transgression, it's only going to lead to further transgression, and it's only going to lead to someone else being transgressed, then you need to stop that transgression, and that's out of love as well. The Prophet said, help your brother when he's being transgressed and when he is transgressing, when he's oppressed and when he's oppressing. He said, Ya Rasulullah, how can we understand we can help someone when they're being oppressed? How do we help someone when they're oppressing? The Prophet said, by stopping him from committing that oppression. So especially when someone else is doing wrong, you need to take up the cause of that person. And every time we see in the seerah of the Prophet getting angry, and by the way, I think, again, this is something I talked about in RIS as well, that a lot of times we almost romanticize the image of the Prophet and we forget that the Prophet got mad sometimes. When Aisha said he got mad, he got more mad than anyone else does. Okay, so the anger of the Prophet was greater than the anger of anyone else when he got mad. But he never got angry for himself. He got angry when the bounds of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were crossed, or when people were transgressed. He would get angry for Allah. And so he wouldn't transgress when he got angry, because obviously that's what he was fighting against in the first place. So his anger was not him screaming like a maniac or knocking things over, right? But the Prophet ﷺ showed anger, and the Prophet ﷺ spoke with a roaring voice sometimes. I've got news for you, so did Jesus, peace be upon him. Even from just a pure biblical perspective. I mean, come on, he wasn't always smiling and saying, turn the other cheek. He walks into a temple and starts flipping tables. Alright? Isa also got angry, the prophets got angry. Both of these men are described as rahmah by Allah, described as mercy by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So especially when there is a risk of someone else being transgressed, you have to stand up. And the Prophet ﷺ used to get very angry when someone else was transgressed. And even in regards to his marital relationship with Islam, the only time you see the Prophet ﷺ really get angry is when Khadija was insulted, or when Safiya was insulted, when other people were transgressed. If one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ raised their voice at him, the Prophet ﷺ was quiet. He didn't. The Prophet ﷺ was patient, but when someone else was transgressed, the Prophet ﷺ spoke up, and he spoke up with much authority. Okay? So if there's a risk of someone else being transgressed, then you have to stop that book.
Research actually shows us in families that where there is a pattern of abuse, whether verbal or physical, that children who are witnesses to this violence or abuse often then in their lives replicate that. And so the notion of this kind of question is not just that you're doing it, for yourself or for your own benefit, but it's actually trying to come as a community, giving the children the resources to process, and even adults to process the kind of challenging situations that we're living with, but not to, use Islam or religion to justify our actions in any way. And I think this is one of the greatest messages that we can give and work in this area with organizations like Peaceful Families and Faith and others that are doing this kind of work, is that this pattern of disrespect is, I think, a very polite way of saying it, but it's just an opening to a larger issue, and we should avoid it at all costs.
Alright. There's a question here about how can Muslims, especially youth, deal with the situation of homosexuality. I know this is a very, very controversial topic in today's society. What do we do, or should we support without being discriminatory, without any discrimination? Look, there are things that we can't compromise on in regards to our theology. We absolutely cannot compromise in regards to our theology in the way Islam views a person, engaging in any acts with someone of the same gender. I'm trying to be as PG as I can. Okay, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala doesn't punish anyone for their feelings or for their inclinations. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala punishes when a person acts upon those things. That's what sinful behavior. So, number one, I think we have to be very, very, very careful. This is part of media. This is part of us being fed certain things. It is not a conclusion that a person is born that way. It's not a conclusion. In fact, there is an article in the Huffington Post that said the last 8 studies actually showed that it's more of a result of cultural conditioning in media than anyone else. Ironically, they actually used the Middle East as an example to say the type of women that Middle Eastern men tend to be attracted to, the color, the hair, the complexion, those types of things. Media feeds you certain things. So this is a result of conditioning more than anything else. So we can't just say that if a person desires something. Wallahi, I know this is going to sound really, really, really sick, and this isn't PG at all, I'm sorry. But I've had someone come to me before and say, look, I'm attracted to my sister. Why can't I marry my sister? It's like, that's, yeah, that's pretty gross, right? But what am I supposed to say, right? So, well, I feel this way. Why can't I? And subhanAllah, where do we draw the line in regards to what is considered deviant behavior and acceptable behavior in regards to this topic? That does not mean that we have a disrespectful or intolerant or hateful rhetoric. Study Lut alayhi salam and his rhetoric, the way he addressed his people. He actually addressed his people very respectfully. Lut alayhi salam did not go up to them and say, you monkeys, you animals, and you this and you that, start cursing them and saying things. No, Lut alayhi salam tried to reason with them. He was very respectful. His rhetoric was very, very respectful, was very compassionate to a point. He said, look, these are my daughters. Would any one of you like to marry my daughters? That's how respectful the rhetoric of Lut alayhi salam was, and caring and compassionate the rhetoric of Lut alayhi salam was. Lut alayhi salam interacted with the society, there's no doubt. So our rhetoric should not be intolerant, should not be hateful, but we have a clear position regarding our deen in regards to this, and we shouldn't compromise on that position. Now there's a legal discussion, there's a religious discussion. So the religious discussion, there's absolutely no compromise on that. From a religious perspective, we don't view this as something that is acceptable, a person actually acting upon that. And if a person was indeed born that way, and they felt that way, and they felt those inclinations, then, if I feel like doing something, that doesn't mean that I should necessarily do it. Isn't the entire religion of Islam sufficiently based on controlling your desires? Right? And not, and submitting yourself to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala and preferring the worship of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, the pleasure of Allah to your own desires, isn't about controlling our shahawat, our desires. So even if a person had those desires, regardless of whether it was conditioning or science or whatever it may be, we don't encourage people to just act upon their desires. So this is something that we have a very clear position on in our deen. But again, I think the rhetoric, there is room for the rhetoric to be adjusted. We obviously don't advocate violence or discrimination or hatred or anything of that sort. Compassionately and clearly, we have the position that at the same time our rhetoric should be respectful. Lut alayhi salam's rhetoric was very respectful. By the way, Lut alayhi salam was not just addressing a group of people that had that practice. Lut alayhi salam was addressing a group of people that practiced that practice, and they were very arrogant. And they were very, very confrontational, and he still addressed them very respectfully and with very polite rhetoric, while not compromising or forsaking his position, the position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Just to add on that, the word priming is used in terms of preparing people mentally to accept and or to be ready to accept something that's coming later. And one of the things I think we're making a big mistake with is that we're not actually watching, listening, and carefully observing to the entertainment that our kids are deep into. And I think this is going to come back to haunt us in a big way. The idea there is that, we talk about this today, subhanAllah, about Middle Easterners, Muslims, Arabs being blamed, if you will, for violence and terrorism. How did that happen? there were literally 70 to 80 movies. Literally 70 to 80 movies made, one after the other, until everyone said, when that happens, it has to be those people. And so there was no other choice. When something did happen, Allah knows that everyone said, it has to be them. The priming in entertainment is, subtly, people are mentioning subtle words about everything that is probably contradictory to Islamic teachings. And quietly, whether it's alcohol, or zina and fornication, or homosexuality, and it's just subtle, whether it's in cartoons, or it's in these sitcoms, or in movies, and we think that it's not affecting our kids. We think that it's just going over us, or we think, worst of all, one of the Sheikh Yasser Fazaka from California said, we think that we're smarter than the programmers, so we sit there like with a remote control, like, oh, a scene is coming up. And they're like, oh, alhamdulillah, go to commercial, oh, the commercial's back, right? Go to C-SPAN, right? And then come back. But actually, Allah SWT says, do not approach, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Do not even approach it. Meaning what? That there are even signs that you've been following to know that a scene is coming up that is displeasing to Allah. So even before you attempt to change the channel, you've already processed it. What about the innocent kids that are watching it with you? Or worse, watching it alone with access to the internet. So we're not blaming society. We have to blame ourselves first and say what is coming into our homes, what is coming into our TVs, into our iPads, into anything that our kids are then internalizing, and how are we reacting to it? I think the conversation will be very different. There are also people, other communities, other religious communities that have similar morals in this particular stance. And we should ally with them and say, how are you processing this? How are you helping your kids understand this? Again, we don't discriminate, we're not being at all hateful towards anyone, but we have to understand that our religion gives us the tools to manage much of this, inshallah.
It's funny that you mentioned the thing about the movies, because I remember actually reading about a study in a psychology journal about how they took like these children and they would show them movies with explicit scenes, but they would stop, they would cut the explicit scenes out, and they would tell the children to draw what they think the next scenes were. And they were drawing very explicit material. Even though they weren't seeing it, they basically played out the entire scene. So whenever you change the channel, you're playing the scene out in your head regardless. Your mind is still watching the movie. Your eyes are not, because let's face it, nobody pays attention to C-SPAN anyway, right? If it's C-SPAN. ESPN maybe. ESPN can distract you. But your mind is still processing it. Your mind is still constantly processing that. SubhanAllah, there was another study. They actually let people watch like some of the modern day cartoons, and they obviously, if you notice every cartoon that you watch, the dad is a complete idiot, right? Every show, every cartoon, for like the last 20, 30 years, the father is just a complete bonehead, doesn't know what's going on, and the mother is naive, right? Go ahead, think about all those cartoons. Go through them one by one. Dad is dumb, mom is naive. Right or wrong? It's always like that. So how do you expect children that are fed that their entire lives to treat their parents? Right? How do you expect them to treat their parents? So there's, conditioning and priming is something that's very, very strong, it's very significant, and you have to understand in regards to all these different aspects. How many more questions are we going to take?
While you read that one, so this one just said very quickly, what is the first step you should take towards helping humanity? Realistically, I can't go to Africa to have lunch with an orphan to soften my heart. Where do I start? SubhanAllah, no, don't laugh. This is a very sincere person, because too often we make these arguments and we don't even think about it. We tell kids, when they're not eating, finishing their plate, we're like, there are kids starving in Africa, and in America they'll tell you, get a post, get an envelope, we'll mail the food to them. They get smart with you because you're giving them unrealistic expectations or unrealistic conversation pieces. I would actually say the person is very serious in talking about softening their heart. So the second part is more important. And the reality is, you don't actually have to go to Africa at all. In Loudoun County, if you talk to the families, the organizations that are feeding people who are hungry, and literally, they're facing food insecurity. We had never talked about that as America because we've had, excess amount of food, and clearly it's going to parts of our body that are just, you can see it in how things are shaping up. But the reality is, you don't have to go that far. All you have to do is go and talk to some of these food banks that are working. The Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts work with the Scouting for Food banks are literally helping families who are barely making it till the end of the month. They do like 2-3 weeks of food they have, and the end of I've seen the documentary where the 3rd week the boy goes and he's showing the camera person, he goes, look, he goes, this is by the 4th week, this is what happens. And he opens the fridge, opens the cupboards, all empty. All empty, subhanAllah. And this is in America, in Loudoun County, like probably a few streets around where we live. So you don't have to go anywhere else. And even worse than that, if you think about softening our hearts, I always think about, just imagine what life was like, even if you meet no one who is hungry or an orphan or a poor, of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, who could have had anything on earth. And the hadith tell us that sometimes the days went by when no smoke or fire was seen over the house of Muhammad ﷺ, meaning no warm food was cooked for months at a time. Months at a time. And we're raising generations that if you give them the same food between lunch and dinner, they're like, what is this? Like, we just had this. Right? That's the kind of attitude. So inshallah, the same sincerity with which you gave this, we ask Allah to definitely soften all of our hearts, because there is much suffering in America. Look up the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Google that and look up it's called an annual report called The Status of Hunger and Homelessness Annually. Status of hunger and homelessness, not in Africa, not in Europe, not in Asia, but in America. They choose about 25 capitals of cities in America, and they do it every year. And you'll be humbled in terms of how desperate life is right here in our neighborhood, and we're not doing much about it. So I think that would soften our hearts quite a bit.
Also, you know, I talked about earlier that I don't like to fundraise, and we're not going to fundraise right now, even though Dr. really wants to fundraise. I wish that we could fundraise for like volunteers. For ignorantly. I wish that like we could have events where we just say volunteers. It will change your life. It will change your life to dedicate yourself to this organization, to these fields, inshallah ta'ala. Don't worry, I'm going to tell people to talk to you, don't worry, inshallah. but seriously, if you want, you know, volunteer, ignorantly has a Feed the Homeless program. These, you don't have to always reinvent the wheel. They have organizations doing these things. There's only Muslim organizations where you be comfortable. Please do approach the brother, inshallah ta'ala, and say, I want to volunteer for the next program, inshallah ta'ala. That's far more valuable than any money that you can give. The second thing, before I read this last question, the second thing which I feel like is very significant, I don't think I've ever really talked about this publicly, but I'm going to talk about it now, inshallah ta'ala, because I think we need to start having this discussion openly. Muslims as a minority fall far behind. We are really, really lagging in terms of foster parenting and adopting children. We are the least likely people in this country as a minority to adopt, and that's something that is really, really, I see it as a huge problem, and I see it as a huge misunderstanding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not prevent us or prohibit us from foster care or even adopting children. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited at-tabanni, which is to rob someone of their lineage. To lie to someone and say they're not, rob them of their lineage and make it seem like they're from your lineage, and to take them as a son or as a daughter where they don't even know where they came from and they don't understand their lineage and their lineage is lost. However, the hadith, the true meaning of the hadith, that I am Interfaith yatim, the one who sponsors an orphan, are like these two fingers in Jannah, is actually a person who takes an orphan in and who gives that orphan a new life. And I think, starting with myself, we really need to start, each and every single one of us as Muslims need to start thinking about whether or not we can handle this, inshallah ta'ala, where we can go out and we can adopt children, inshallah ta'ala, and be foster parents to children, inshallah. There are tons of Muslim children, tons of non-Muslim children, and the only thing that is prohibited is robbing them of their lineage. And subhanAllah, I was having this discussion with some of my teachers yesterday. Alhamdulillah, I finally got one of my mashayikh to agree with me at least. About changing the last name. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَدِعُوهُمْ لِأَبَائِهِمْ, that you should call them by the names of their fathers, and that is more just to them. And I've been arguing with one of my teachers over the last 4 or 5 months that حفظ العرض or nasl, which is one of maqasid sharia, one of the objectives of sharia, protecting the lineage. Protecting the lineage never historically came through the last name, it came through the middle name. The laqab or the nickname or whatever, the tribe name, was said at the end as a description of a person, but it was Omar bin so-and-so, right? Fatima bint Muhammad. as long as the lineage is being protected through the middle name, then the lineage does not have to be protected through the last name. So I don't see the problem. Alhamdulillah, one of my teachers, who's a very prestigious scholar, actually agreed with me yesterday, finally, alhamdulillah. He said, I agree with you. I don't see a problem with someone adopting a child and changing their last name even, and not changing their middle name, protecting the lineage of the middle names where they know who their real parents were and things of that sort. But so they're not looked at as awkward in society, as outcasts in society. When you look at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and orphans at that time, people from the same family would have different names. They'd be known by different things, right? Different nicknames. So it wouldn't be strange to go to school at that time, it wasn't really school, but to be with your brother, and your brother is called by something totally different. Here, obviously, in America, one of the greatest concerns is, what am I going to tell this kid? He's going to go to school with his brothers and sisters, and he's going to have a last name, she's going to have a last name, be a total outcast. I don't see a problem with changing the last name as long as the lineage is protected through the middle name, inshallah. How does that person understand where they came from as they become adults and things of that sort? Also, a child can become a mahram, can become just like an actual child through breastfeeding. Okay, so if a child is breastfed before the age of 2, then they will become mahram to both the mother and the father. Okay, so it can really be a child that you can raise in your house like any other child. Of course, as far as inheritance is concerned, you have that 1/3 of your inheritance that you can designate as you do. You can even designate. You can even will, something for that child, inshallah. So they would really, in full effect, be like any one of your other children. This is what the Prophet ﷺ did. The Prophet ﷺ did take children in. The Prophet ﷺ did raise children. The Prophet ﷺ did not, he raised them in a way that they didn't feel like social outcasts as well. And this is something we really, we're falling behind as a community in this regard. And I hope, inshallah ta'ala, we can start thinking, again, I'm starting with myself, making intention. If you are financially capable of doing so, think about adopting a child, inshallah ta'ala, and really giving them a new life. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we would be like the Prophet as these 2 fingers on the day of judgment, even if we just made the intention of Allah. Last thing, you concluded by saying that the Muslim community should begin being active in universal crises. I agree, but how do we get the international community involved in our crisis? It's very simple. If you don't sympathize with the people, again, if you don't show any empathy in regards to their crises, their trials, and their afflictions, then they're not going to really care for yours. They're not going to care for your cause if you don't care for their cause. And so when we care for their causes and when we reach out to people and we become active members of our society, there's a brother who's actually from DC, someone that I really love, Dr. Muhammad al-Talib, who said that, subhanAllah, I heard him in the last mass convention a few weeks ago in Chicago, and he said that every Muslim just touched 40 people's lives, and there wouldn't be a single American in this country that did not know a Muslim. If every Muslim just touched 40 people, right, just knew 40 people, just interacted with 40 people, and gave a positive impression of Islam, there would not be a single American that did not know Islam, okay, or know about Muslims. So it's part of them knowing us, inshallah ta'ala, the people knowing us, knowing our causes. And subhanAllah, when they're exposed to us and they understand that we're real human beings that care for them, that they should care for us, then I'm telling you, personally speaking, as far as the Palestinian cause is concerned in particular, and someone mentioned to me, which is true, Rachel Corrie was actually a Jewish woman. She wasn't a Christian woman, actually. That was a slip of the tongue. In New Orleans, the woman that used to organize all of the pro-Palestinian rallies and events and awareness campaigns was also a young American Jew. Okay? When people are exposed to us as human beings and they know our causes and they know that we care about their causes as well, then they might champion our causes, they might champion our causes a lot better than we do. And I'm tired right now, I'm making a lot of, stuttering, so I'm just going to go ahead and stop that. Dr. Altaf Hussain.
We wanted to also thank Sheikh Omar before we close. SubhanAllah, one of the things that we make dua for always with these kinds of events is that we as a community benefit when they come and they present. But clearly it's a sacrifice to be away from their family and their kids. And so we ask Allah to return him safely and to indeed protect him and preserve him. Brother Muhammad Bankura is just going to close out with just making a few announcements about ICNA, ICNA relief. So just stay put for a second, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan for coming. I didn't expect this type of turnout, especially on a short notice, so I really appreciate all of you who came. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all of you and bless the community. MashaAllah, this is a flourishing community. Allah bless the administration and all of the attendees.
please wait, inshallah, for the last announcements. I promise you we won't take long, okay?
Assalamu alaikum. So, as we were just saying, alhamdulillah, we only have few days, like less than a week to organize this event, and alhamdulillah, we have a good turnout, and we're not even expecting this kind of people to be here, but alhamdulillah. Just before you leave, today inshallah, as they were mentioning, the goal is for everyone to be involved in what we do economically. So at least when you go home, if you don't do anything, we have a table outside, you can go and sign up as to volunteer or sign up to help out however you can. But at least when you go home, just remember ICNArelief.org, ICNArelief.org, and we remember that, all of us, inshallah. So just remember ICNArelief.org, and then go to ICNArelief.org and check out what we do. You understand what I mean? From there you can see things that we do, things that you can be involved with, and alhamdulillah, so you can at least try to help out what we do. And alhamdulillah, these are things that we need to be involved in. So please, inshallah, when you go home, ICNArelief.org, check out the website, see what we do, or at least, if you want, you can also give your name at the table, if you really table outside, to volunteer with whatever program you want to volunteer with, inshallah. A last question, Al-Maghrib answers to this announcement. Al-Maghrib class next week at Mason, Fiqh of Dawah, inshallah.
جزاكم الله خيرا سبحانك وبحمدك اشهد ان لا اله الا انت استغفرك واتوب اليك اعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر ان الانسان لفي خسر الا الذين امنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى اله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.
Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah. Subhanallah.